Frank Morrison had always believed that retirement would bring peace, but the silence in his cramped apartment above the abandoned auto shop felt more like a prison sentence. At 68, with arthritis gnawing at his knuckles and a pension that barely covered his medications, he spent most days staring at the rust-stained concrete where he'd once brought engines back to life. The town of Millbrook had withered around him like autumn leaves, its main street dotted with boarded storefronts, and its young people long since fled to bigger cities with better promises. 3 months after his forced retirement, when the new corporate chain had bought out Peterson's garage and deemed him redundant, Frank spotted the classified ad that would change everything. An old Airstream trailer, circa 1970, sitting in a farmer's field 20 miles outside town. The asking price was $80, which seemed reasonable for something he could fix up and maybe live in, away from the memories that haunted every corner of his current existence. His Sarah had always dreamed of traveling in a silver bullet like that, back when dreams still seemed possible and cancer was just a word other people whispered about. The seller, a weathered farmer named Dutch, seemed eager to be rid of the thing. "Been sitting there since I bought this property 15 years ago, Dutch explained, scratching his gray stubble. "Previous owner said it came with the land, but I never had use for it. Thing's probably not worth much, but if you can haul it away, it's yours." Frank counted out 4 crisp $20 bills, money he'd been saving for Sarah's headstone, and felt a strange mixture of guilt and anticipation as Dutch helped him load the trailer onto a borrowed flatbed. Back at his shop, Frank circled the Airstream like a predator studying prey. The aluminum shell was pitted with age and neglect, its once gleaming surface dulled to the color of old pennies. The windows were spider-webbed with cracks, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges. But underneath the decay, he could see the bones of something beautiful, something that whispered of highways stretching toward horizons, and 2 people in love with the possibility of anywhere but here. He started with the basics, pressure washing years of grime and bird droppings from the exterior. As the water stripped away the accumulated neglect, Frank noticed something odd about the trailer's undercarriage. Where most Airstreams had a standard frame, this one seemed modified with additional welding that looked hastily done and deliberately concealed. The welds were amateur work, thick and irregular, as if someone had been in a hurry or working in poor conditions. More curious still, the frame seemed heavier than it should be, as if something substantial had been added to the original structure. Over the next week, Frank found himself returning to the trailer with increasing frequency, drawn by a nagging sense that he was missing something important. His trained mechanic's eye told him that the modifications weren't random. They followed a pattern, creating sealed compartments within the frame itself. On a particularly quiet Thursday afternoon, when the autumn rain drummed against the shop's corrugated roof and the loneliness felt especially sharp, Frank made a decision that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his quiet little town. He retrieved his cutting torch from its dusty corner, where it had sat unused since the diagnosis that had stolen his future with Sarah. The blue flame hissed to life with familiar comfort, and Frank carefully began cutting through one of the suspicious welds. The metal parted like old skin, revealing a hollow space that definitely hadn't been part of the original design. Inside, wrapped in plastic and sealed with electrical tape, were bundles of documents and what looked like photographs. Frank's hands trembled as he extracted the first bundle, partly from the arthritis but mostly from a growing sense that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. The documents were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, and as he spread them across his workbench under the harsh fluorescent light, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. These weren't just any documents, they were surveyors' reports, geological studies, and most disturbing of all, internal memoranda from Hartwell Industries, the mining conglomerate that had dominated Millbrook's economy for decades until their sudden departure in 1995. The photographs were worse, black and white images showing massive underground caverns, but not the kind carved by nature. These were clearly man-made, with concrete walls and steel reinforcements, and in several shots Frank could make out what looked like rows upon rows of metal drums, each marked with symbols he recognized as warnings for hazardous materials. The dates stamped on the back of the photos ranged from 1987 to 1994, the final years of Hartwell's operations in the area, but it was the memoranda that made Frank's stomach clench with dread. Written in the cold clinical language of corporate communication, they detailed a systematic cover-up that spanned nearly a decade. Hartwell had been using the abandoned sections of their iron ore mine as an illegal dumping ground for industrial waste from their operations across 3 states. Heavy metals, chemical solvents, radioactive materials from their brief foray into uranium extraction, all of it buried deep beneath Millbrook in chambers that were supposed to be sealed forever. The documents revealed that someone within the company had grown a conscience, documenting the illegal dumping with methodical precision. The whistleblower had remained anonymous, but their evidence was damning. Photos of midnight convoys bringing unmarked trucks into the mine, shipping manifests that didn't match official records, and most terrifyingly, medical reports showing elevated cancer rates in the surrounding communities that Hartwell had managed to suppress through a combination of bribes and intimidation. Frank thought about Sarah's sudden illness, how the doctors had seemed baffled by the aggressive nature of her cancer, how it had spread so quickly through her body despite her relatively young age of 59. He thought about the Hendersons down the street, who had lost their teenage son to leukemia just 2 years earlier. He thought about old Pete Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, whose brain tumor had taken him right around the time Hartwell had packed up and left town, claiming the iron ore deposits were exhausted. As the implications settled over him like a burial shroud, Frank realized that the trailer hadn't ended up in that farmer's field by accident. Someone had hidden this evidence, probably planning to use it eventually, but never getting the chance. The final document in the stack was a letter, handwritten and dated just 3 days before Hartwell's announced closure of the Millbrook facility. It was addressed to no one in particular, but the desperation was clear in every line. "I can't live with this anymore," the letter began. They said the waste would be contained, that the old mine shafts were perfect for long-term storage, that nobody would ever need to know, but the seals are failing. "I've seen the water samples from the wells near Sector 7. The contamination is spreading and they know it. They're not closing because the ore is gone. They're running before anyone connects the deaths to what we've done. I've documented everything, all the evidence they'll need to make this right, but I don't know who I can trust. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this and have the courage to do what I couldn't." The letter was unsigned, but clipped to it was an employee badge photo of a young woman with earnest eyes and prematurely gray hair. The name on the badge read, Jennifer Walsh, Environmental Compliance Officer. Frank stared at the photo for a long moment, wondering what had happened to Jennifer Walsh and why her evidence had ended up hidden in a trailer frame instead of in the hands of federal investigators. The next morning brought news that made Frank's hands shake as he poured his coffee. The Millbrook Gazette, such as it was in its reduced weekly format, carried a front-page story about the proposed development of the old Hartwell mine site. A company called Sunrise Properties, backed by what the paper described as significant out-of-state investment, planned to turn the abandoned industrial area into a residential subdivision and shopping complex. The groundbreaking was scheduled for the following month, pending final environmental clearances. Frank read the article 3 times, each pass making him feel more nauseated. The developer's representative, quoted extensively in the piece, assured residents that all environmental testing had shown the site to be perfectly safe for residential use. "We've invested heavily in comprehensive soil and water analysis," the representative claimed. "This development will bring new life to Millbrook and provide much-needed housing and employment opportunities." But Frank now knew what lay beneath that soil, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a lead weight. Those drums of industrial waste, sealed in what Jennifer Walsh's documents suggested were already failing containment chambers, would be disturbed by construction. The contamination that had already seeped into the groundwater would be stirred up, spread around, and then covered over with houses where families would live and children would play in yards built on top of a toxic graveyard. He spent the rest of the day pacing around the trailer, Jennifer Walsh's evidence spread across his workbench like an indictment of everything wrong with the world. Part of him wanted to simply repackage the documents and pretend he'd never found them. He was an old man with failing health and no family left to worry about. He could sell the trailer, move somewhere warm, and let Millbrook's problems remain Millbrook's problems. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But every time he started to gather up the papers, he thought about Sarah, about the pain she'd endured in those final months, about how she'd whispered apologies to him, as if her illness was somehow her fault. He thought about all the other families who had lost people to mysterious cancers and strange diseases, who had been told it was just bad luck, just the cruel randomness of fate. He thought about the families who would move into those new houses, who would drink water from wells drilled through contaminated soil, who would raise children in the shadow of Hartwell's buried crimes. By evening, Frank had made his decision. He carefully photographed every document with his old digital camera, uploaded the images to a thumb drive, and sealed the originals back in their plastic wrapping. Then he sat down at his kitchen table and began making phone calls, starting with the Environmental Protection Agency's regional office. The first 3 people he spoke with were polite but dismissive, clearly categorizing him as another crank caller with conspiracy theories. But persistence had always been one of Frank's virtues, and eventually he reached someone willing to listen. Dr. Michelle Torres was a senior environmental engineer with the EPA, and something in Frank's voice must have convinced her to take him seriously. When he mentioned Hartwell Industries and described the nature of his evidence, her tone sharpened considerably. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm going to need you to be very careful about who you share this information with. If what you're describing is authentic, there are people who would go to great lengths to keep it buried. Can you meet me tomorrow at a location of your choosing?" Frank suggested the diner on Route 9, a neutral location where they could talk without drawing attention from anyone who might be watching. As he hung up the phone, he realized that his quiet retirement had just ended, and something far more dangerous had begun. For the first time since Sarah's death, Frank Morrison had a purpose that extended beyond his own grief, and it terrified him almost as much as it energized him. That night, he lay awake listening to the October wind rattle the windows of his apartment, thinking about Jennifer Walsh and wondering what had happened to her after she'd hidden her evidence in that trailer frame. He thought about courage and cowardice, about the weight of secrets and the price of speaking truth to power. Somewhere in the darkness before dawn, Frank Morrison stopped being a forgotten old mechanic and began his transformation into something he'd never expected to be: a crusader for the dead and a guardian of the living. The meeting with Dr. Torres went better than Frank had dared hope. She examined his evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood both its implications and its authenticity, and her growing anger was evident in the tight line of her mouth and the furious notes she scribbled in her government-issue notebook. "This is exactly the kind of thing we've suspected about Hartwell for years," she told him over coffee that had long since grown cold. "But they were always very careful to cover their tracks. Your Jennifer Walsh was either very brave or very foolish, probably both." Dr. Torres explained that building a case against Hartwell would be complicated by the passage of time and the company's subsequent dissolution into a maze of subsidiary corporations and shell companies. But the immediate concern was stopping the Sunrise Properties development before construction could begin and make the contamination infinitely worse. "We can get an emergency injunction," she said, "but we'll need more than documents. We'll need soil samples, water analysis, and if possible, access to those underground storage areas." Frank nodded, understanding what she wasn't quite saying. Getting that evidence would mean going into the abandoned mine, into the darkness where Hartwell had buried its crimes. It would mean risking his health and possibly his life to prove what Jennifer Walsh had died trying to expose. Because Frank was now certain that Jennifer Walsh was dead, that her conscience had cost her everything, and that her evidence had ended up in that trailer only because someone had tried to save it for a day of reckoning that had never come. Over the following weeks, Frank found himself at the center of a growing storm. Dr. Torres brought in federal investigators, who brought in attorneys, who brought in politicians suddenly very interested in environmental justice. The Millbrook Gazette, initially skeptical of the old mechanic's claims, began running daily stories about the unfolding scandal. Sunrise Properties attempted to dismiss Frank as a disgruntled local stirring up trouble, but their protests grew weaker as more evidence emerged. The real breakthrough came when investigators located Jennifer Walsh's sister in Phoenix, Arizona. Janet Walsh had been wondering about her sister's disappearance for nearly 30 years, never accepting the official explanation that Jennifer had simply decided to start over somewhere else. She flew to Millbrook with a box of her sister's personal effects, including letters that detailed Jennifer's growing horror at what she'd discovered in her role as environmental compliance officer. She was going to go public, Janet told Frank as they sat in his cluttered apartment. Jennifer's letters spread between them like cards in a tragic hand of solitaire. "The last time I talked to her, she said she'd found evidence that would shut Hartwell down forever. She was scared, but she was determined. She said too many people had already died for her to stay quiet." The letters revealed that Jennifer had been systematically documenting Hartwell's illegal activities for months before her disappearance. She'd identified the locations of multiple dump sites, the types of waste being stored, and the company officials who had authorized the cover-up. More importantly, she discovered that the containment systems were already failing, that contaminated groundwater was spreading toward Millbrook's residential areas, and that Hartwell's management knew it, but had decided to abandon operations rather than face the massive cleanup costs. Armed with Jennifer's detailed records and Frank's physical evidence, federal investigators obtained warrants to search the old mine site. What they found exceeded even the worst expectations suggested by the documents. Hundreds of drums of industrial waste sat corroding in chambers that had never been properly sealed, their contents slowly leaching into the groundwater that fed Millbrook's wells. Radioactive materials from Hartwell's uranium experiments sat in improvised containment areas that had been designed to last maybe 10 years, not the decades they'd already endured. The water testing results were devastating. Wells throughout the residential area showed contamination levels far exceeding federal safety standards, particularly in the neighborhoods closest to the old mine. The elevated cancer rates that Hartwell had worked so hard to suppress were finally explained, and the connection between the company's crimes and the community's suffering became undeniable. Frank watched the investigators work with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice for Jennifer Walsh and for Sarah and for all the others who had paid the price for corporate greed was finally within reach, but it had come too late for too many people. The knowledge that Sarah's death might have been prevented if Jennifer's evidence had surfaced 30 years earlier was almost too much to bear. But even as Frank struggled with his own grief and guilt, the situation took a darker turn. Someone, apparently working for interests connected to the old Hartwell operations, began making threats. Frank's apartment was broken into, though nothing seemed to be stolen. His phone began receiving anonymous calls at all hours, voices telling him to mind his own business if he knew what was good for him. Dr. Torres warned him that powerful people with long memories were likely involved in the cover-up, people who wouldn't hesitate to silence an inconvenient old mechanic. The threats culminated one foggy November evening when Frank returned to his shop to find two men waiting for him in the shadows. They were well-dressed, professional-looking, the kind of people who solved problems quietly and efficiently. One of them, tall and lean with silver hair and cold eyes, stepped forward with the confident air of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Morrison," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Frank couldn't quite place. "You've caused some very important people a great deal of trouble. We're here to offer you an opportunity to make things right." He gestured toward his companion, a shorter, stockier man who kept his hands in his coat pockets in a way that suggested concealed weapons. The offer was simple and generous. Frank would receive a comfortable pension, enough to relocate anywhere he chose and live well for the remainder of his life. All he had to do was recant his claims about the evidence he'd found, suggest that he'd been mistaken about what the documents proved, and disappear quietly from public view. "Think of it as early retirement with benefits," the tall man said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Frank looked at the two men, at their expensive suits and their casual assumption that everyone had a price, and felt something crystallize inside him. For months, he'd been driven by anger and grief, by a desire to make someone pay for what had been taken from him. But now, faced with the reality of what Jennifer Walsh had died for and what the people of Millbrook continued to suffer, Frank Morrison discovered that he'd become something he'd never expected to be. "No," he said simply, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Jennifer Walsh died trying to tell the truth. My Sarah died because people like you decided that profits mattered more than lives. I won't be another person who looks the other way while you bury your crimes." The tall man's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Morrison. We hoped you'd be reasonable." He nodded to his companion, who began moving toward Frank with predatory intent. But Frank Morrison had spent 50 years working with tools and machinery, had developed the reflexes and instincts of someone who understood that a moment's inattention could mean the difference between life and death. As the stocky man reached for whatever he carried in his pocket, Frank's hand closed around a heavy wrench on his workbench. The blow caught his attacker in the temple, dropping him like a sack of grain. The tall man drew a pistol with practiced efficiency, but Frank was already moving, using the trailer as cover while he reached for his phone. The first shot sparked off the Airstream's aluminum skin. The second shattered a window in the shop's office. Frank managed to dial 911 before the third shot, which caught him in the shoulder and sent him sprawling behind the trailer's rear axle. "Federal agents are already on their way," Frank called out, hoping it was true. "This place is under surveillance because of the investigation. You kill me, and you'll have the FBI crawling all over whatever's left of your operation." Whether it was true or not, the claim gave the tall man pause. Frank heard whispered conversation. then footsteps moving toward the shop's entrance. A few moments later, a car engine started, and tires squealed on asphalt as his attackers fled into the night. The ambulance arrived before the police, followed closely by Dr. Torres and a team of federal agents who had indeed been keeping Frank under protective surveillance. As paramedics worked on his wounded shoulder, Frank felt a strange sense of completion. He'd made his choice, faced the consequences, and survived to see justice finally within reach. The attempted murder of a federal witness provided prosecutors with the leverage they needed to break open the decades-old conspiracy. The tall man, identified as Marcus Kellerman, a former Hartwell security chief who had continued working for the company's successor entities, was arrested at the Canadian border 2 days later. His confession, offered in exchange for a reduced sentence, implicated a network of corporate executives, government officials, and private contractors who had worked together to suppress Jennifer Walsh's evidence and silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Jennifer Walsh's body was found 3 weeks later, buried in a remote section of the old mine property where investigators were conducting soil analysis. She'd been shot once in the head, execution style, and her remains were carefully exhumed with the respect due to someone who had died as a martyr for environmental justice. Her funeral, attended by hundreds of people who had never known her but understood what she'd sacrificed, became a rallying point for the community's demand for justice and restoration. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Hartwell's successor companies were held liable for the contamination and ordered to fund a comprehensive cleanup that would take decades and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The Sunrise Properties development was permanently blocked, and the entire mine site was designated as a Superfund cleanup location under federal oversight. More importantly for the people of Millbrook, the settlement included provisions for medical monitoring and treatment for anyone who had lived in the affected area during the contamination period. Families who had lost loved ones to mysterious cancers and other diseases finally had answers, and more critically, resources to address their ongoing health needs. Frank Morrison, meanwhile, discovered that heroism was more complicated than he'd expected. The media attention was overwhelming, with reporters and documentary filmmakers wanting to tell the story of the retired mechanic who had brought down a corporate conspiracy. He cooperated with the investigators and testified at the trials, but mostly he just wanted to return to the quiet life he'd been living before Jennifer Walsh's evidence had changed everything. The trailer that had started it all was eventually donated to the Smithsonian as part of an exhibit on environmental whistleblowers and corporate accountability. Frank kept one photo from Jennifer's collection, a picture of the young woman smiling beside a stream that ran clear and clean through the mountains outside Millbrook. He framed it and hung it in his shop, next to a picture of Sarah taken during their honeymoon. Two women who had been taken too soon but whose deaths had finally found meaning. Millbrook began to change in the months following the settlement. Young families started moving back as news spread about the cleanup efforts and the economic opportunities they created. The main street, empty and deteriorating for so long, began showing signs of life as new businesses opened and old ones expanded. The town had been given a second chance built on a foundation of truth rather than buried lies. Frank Morrison never did get that peaceful retirement he'd been looking forward to. Instead, he found himself serving on oversight committees, consulting with environmental groups and speaking to communities facing similar battles with corporate polluters. At 70, he was busier than he'd ever been, traveling to places he'd never expected to see, fighting battles he'd never imagined he'd be qualified for. But late at night, when the work was done and the phone calls finished, Frank would sit in his apartment looking at those two framed photographs and feel something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Purpose. Peace. The knowledge that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost, and that ordinary people could still make extraordinary differences in a world that often seemed determined to crush hope beneath the weight of indifference and greed. The final chapter of the Hartwell scandal came 2 years later, when the last of the corporate executives was sentenced and the cleanup efforts were showing measurable progress. Frank was invited to speak at the dedication of the Jennifer Walsh Memorial Park, built on a section of the former mine site that had been successfully remediated and transformed into a green space for the community. Standing before the crowd of residents, officials, and media representatives, Frank Morrison realized that he'd traveled further than he ever could have imagined in that rusty trailer. From a forgotten old man waiting to die in silence, he'd become a voice for the voiceless, a champion for truth in a world that often preferred comfortable lies. Jennifer Walsh died because she couldn't live with keeping secrets that were killing her neighbors, Frank told the assembled crowd. She hid her evidence in that old trailer, hoping that someday someone would find it and have the courage to do what she couldn't finish. I don't know if I had courage or if I was just too angry and too tired to be scared, but I know that Jennifer's story didn't end when they buried her in that mine. It continued every time someone chose truth over comfort, justice over safety, hope over resignation. As the crowd dispersed and the media packed up their equipment, Frank walked alone through the memorial park, past the plaque that bore Jennifer Walsh's name and the words she'd written in her final letter about praying that someone would find her evidence and have the courage to do what she couldn't. The late afternoon sun filtered through the young trees that had been planted where toxic waste drums had once sat corroding, and Frank Morrison understood that some stories never really end. They just transform into new chapters written by people brave enough to pick up the pen.